She was just 15, a quiet, church-going girl from a small Louisiana town who had dreams of a simple life, maybe teaching Sunday school, maybe becoming a nurse. But fate had a very different plan. And it started with a boy named Jimmy. Jimmy Swaggart was 17, dirt poor, talented and dangerously charming. He wasn't polished, he wasn't rich, but he had something that made everyone stop and listen. Passion. Passion for music, passion for God, and passion for Frances. The moment they met in that dusty little church in Wisner, Louisiana, something shifted. It wasn't love at first sight, not for Frances, but for Jimmy. He knew. He said he was going to marry me the first time we talked, Frances would later recall in a rare, raw interview. I thought he was out of his mind. But by the next year, they were married. And for over 70 years, Frances Swaggart stood by his side, through revival tents, sex scandals, fame, fortune, public disgrace, and private pain. Now, as the world mourns Jimmy Swaggart's death, the one woman who knew him best is finally telling the truth. And it's not what anyone expected. I didn't want a fairy tale, I wanted a purpose. In a generation where teen marriages were common but not always lasting, Frances knew what she was doing. I wasn't pressured, I wasn't stupid. I said yes because something in my soul told me this man was going to change the world, Frances said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. But even she couldn't have predicted what lay ahead. Jimmy was driven, almost to obsession. He wasn't content preaching in small churches, he wanted the world. Frances, who had grown up with rules and structure, could see the chaos coming. But she stayed. Jimmy wasn't safe, but he was called. And I wanted to be part of that calling, no matter the cost. For it was never about fairy tales, it was about faith. The price of being a preacher's wife, what no one saw behind the scenes, was the cost of that decision. By the 1970s, Jimmy Swaggart had exploded onto the American religious scene. His fiery sermons, piano-driven gospel music, and televised crusades made him a household name. Money started rolling in, fame followed. Then came the pressure. While Jimmy stood in front of cameras, Frances held everything else together. The finances, the family, the ministry, and the secrets. I had to carry things most women never imagine. I wasn't just his wife, I was his shield. She ran the ministry's finances with an iron grip, overseeing everything from payroll to building operations. Staff members whispered about how Frances runs the place like Fort Knox, but without her discipline, the empire might have collapsed long before the scandal hit. You think standing next to a pulpit is easy? Try standing behind it, holding it up. The affair that almost broke everything then came 1988. America was rocked by the sex scandal that would nearly destroy Jimmy Swaggart's empire. Images of the weeping preacher begging for forgiveness were burned into public memory. But behind those headlines was a woman who had to decide, not whether her husband had failed, but whether she would stay. I cried, I screamed, I walked out of the house and didn't come back for a night. But deep down I knew I wasn't leaving. Why? Because I didn't marry perfection, I married purpose. And God never told me to run, He told me to rebuild. Frances would later admit it took months, maybe years, to trust him again. But she never left his side, even when the world mocked her. Even when some of her closest friends said she was being a fool. People think staying makes you weak. No, sometimes staying makes you stronger than steel. A woman came forward. Then another. Allegations, headlines, tabloid photos. And then the moment that would never be forgotten. Jimmy Swaggart standing before millions, crying, shaking, saying the words, "I have said to the press." She didn't leave him. But she didn't pretend either. She was hurt, humiliated, angry. Behind closed doors she cried, she screamed. She left for a night just to breathe. But then she came back. People asked her why. Why stay with a man who cheated? Why protect a man who broke your heart in public? Her answer was simple. I didn't marry Jimmy because he was perfect. I married him because he had a calling. And when God calls someone, you don't walk away when it gets ugly. You stay, you fight, you pray. She wasn't naive. She wasn't weak. She made a decision and she stood by it. Not for appearances, not for money, but because she still believed. Over the years, more scandals followed, some public, some private. Frances never ran. She stood beside Jimmy, even when the world called her foolish, even when supporters disappeared and donations dropped. She never changed her story. She never gave excuses. She just kept doing the work. She hosted a program called Frances and Friends, where she addressed tough theological and political questions. She ran her staff with strict order. She defended the ministry when people mocked it. She watched her son Donnie grow into a preacher. She watched her grandchildren enter the ministry. She watched Jimmy age, slow down, and eventually fall ill. Through it all, Frances never asked for praise. She never tried to become a celebrity. In fact, she disliked the spotlight. She only stepped into it when it was necessary to protect what they built. After Jimmy's death, Frances sat quietly during the private memorial. She didn't cry in front of everyone, but those close to her said she was quieter than usual. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't give interviews. But in a letter shared with close ministry leaders, she wrote the words, "I was 15 when I married him. Everyone thought I was making a mistake. Maybe I was. But here we are, 72 years later. We built something. We survived things no one should have to survive, and in the end, I regret nothing." That sentence went viral among followers. It was quoted in churches, shared online, talked about in small circles of women who had stood by their own husbands through hard times. Some people saw it as strength, others called it denial. But Frances didn't care what people thought. She never did. She made her choice long ago, and she stood by it. In a world where people leave marriages over minor disagreements, Frances became a symbol of old-school faith, quiet strength, and the kind of loyalty that can't be explained with modern logic. She still lives in Baton Rouge, still attends services, still helps with the ministry. She doesn't talk much about the past, but when she does, her voice is calm. Was it easy? No. Did I ever think about walking away? Of course. But I believe God put us together for a reason, and I wasn't going to quit just because life got hard. That is Frances Swaggart, a girl who said yes at 15, a woman who stood beside a man through fire and fame, a wife who made a promise and kept it, not because it was easy, but because she believed. She still wears her wedding ring, not because she has to, but because she wants to. And when people ask her what she would say to that 15-year-old girl, she smiles and says, "Say yes. You have no idea what's coming. But you're stronger than you think." No fame, no money, no headlines can define a woman like that. Only faith can. Only time can. And Frances Swaggart gave both. They were poor, inexperienced, and living in rural Louisiana, where churches were small, families were big, and expectations were simple. Frances was the kind of girl who took church seriously. Her family didn't have much, but they had faith. She never imagined herself living a public life. She wasn't chasing fame, and she certainly wasn't chasing a troubled boy with a guitar and a gospel in his heart. But somehow, that's where life took her. Jimmy Swaggart wasn't easy to love, not in the beginning, and not for the next 70 years either. He was restless, intense, and hungry for something bigger than the life around him. He didn't have a plan, just a sense that he was called. He didn't have money, just a voice. But he had eyes that burned, kind of spiritual ambition. And Frances noticed that the first time she met him. Frances and Jimmy married in October 1952. No grand wedding, no photographers. Just a quiet ceremony and a whispered vow. They were poor, dirt poor. Jimmy earned $30 a week pumping gas. They lived in church basements and beat-up trailers, surviving on donated food and borrowed prayer. But Frances wasn't afraid of struggle. She was afraid of wasted purpose. There was something in him I couldn't explain. He wasn't stable, but he was anointed, and I couldn't walk away from that. In an era where most women married for security or status, Frances married for mission. She believed Jimmy's voice was meant for more than four walls, and even though he had nothing, she saw everything.